And from the enraged reaction to the bell curve, a new reader might expect the book to be blatant and unapologetic racist propaganda, a neo-Nazi screed arguing for the supremacy of the high IQ white race and such things as that. I go very easy on the book in like the first half an hour, basically, to bait people into watching it. Like from the first, I'd say at least 15 minutes of the video, you cannot tell whose like side I'm on or what angle I'm coming at it from. It's very clever. Richard Herrnstein passed away shortly before The Bell Curve was released, but the other author, Charles Murray, has in recent years, among other things, been on an episode of Making Sense with Sam Harris. He's been interviewed on Stefan Molyneux's YouTube channel, had his ideas discussed on the Joe Rogan podcast, and regular viewers of my channel will remember The Bell Curve being cited in a recent Steven Crowder video. That's me listing off Murray's accomplishments there, but I deliberately only list off like really bottom of the barrel rubbish internet racist shows he's been on. I act like that's all he's done. That's just me being really shitty without seeming like it, that bit.
So in his stream, Shaun, who I will differentiate from Shaun last, who is a responsible anti-racist researcher, Shaun spoke a little too freely about his motivations and tactics. He sort of let the cat out of the bag. Shaun claims Charles Murray doesn't know how heritability works. Now, to his credit, Shaun makes a satisfactory explanation of heritability, which is more than you can say for most who deny divergent human evolution. So let's see how Shaun describes heritability, and then we'll compare that to what Charles Murray said in The Bell Curve.
The technical academic meaning of heritability is rather different. Heritability is a numerical concept used to estimate the contribution of genetic variance to overall variance of a trait within a group. So basically, heritability estimates the degree to which the variance of a trait within a group is due to genetics. Height is thus a heritable trait. Taller parents will generally have taller offspring, for example, and this is measurable against a population group.
To my surprise at the time, Shaun's description of heritability up to this point is largely correct. It's satisfactory. Now, let's see how Charles Murray describes heritability in The Bell Curve. Well, what we want to know is how much of the variation in IQ in a population, the aggregated differences among the individuals, is due to variations in genetic endowments and how much is due to variations in environment. If all the population variation in IQ is due to variation in environment, then the heritability is 0. If half is due to environmental variation, it is 0.5. If none is due to environmental variation, it is 1. Heritability, in other words, is a ratio that ranges between 0 and 1 and measures the relative contribution of genes to the variation observed in a trait. So there we have it, a satisfactory and accurate explanation of heritability by Charles Murray in The Bell Curve. But Shaun does not show the viewer this in his video. This passage is kept from the viewer. He claims that Charles Murray does not know what heritability means, not by quoting anything from The Bell Curve or some other writing from Charles Murray, but by quoting a flubbed response on a live interview.
These issues are pathetically misunderstood by Charles Murray. In a CNN interview reported in the New Republic, Murray declared, when we say 60% heritability, it's not 60% of the variation, it is 60% of the IQ in any given person. Later, he repeated that for the average person, 60% of the intelligence comes from heredity, and added that this was true of the human species, missing the point that heritability makes no sense for an individual and that heritability statistics are population relative.
Now, Shaun had to go out of his way to find the interview instead of using the explanation of heritability from The Bell Curve itself in a video about The Bell Curve. In order to smear the bell curve, Skull-Shaun ignores the definition of heritability presented in the bell curve itself and instead reaches out to a obscure, flubbed interview response by Charles Murray in a live setting. There is no way this is accidental. This is intentional dishonesty. Now, Skull-Shaun claims all sorts of hypocrisy on Murray's part, saying that Murray says one thing about the heritability of intelligence differences between populations, but then supports policies that wildly contradict that. And the supposed contradiction is based on this quote that he uses over and over and over again.
For example, it makes no sense to claim that IQ explains only a tiny amount of the variance between people, and that you cannot know what someone will do from their IQ, as Herrnstein and Murray do, and then move on to claim that IQ is one of the best ways of determining an employee's individual productivity, and employers should pick applicants with the highest IQs.
He uses the word individual here, and I think it's intentional, as you'll see why in a moment. But this is not an individual question. This is an aggregation of all employees in a sample, looking at predictors of a trait, in this case some index of job performance. To think of it another way, it's a class comparison between the cluster of employees who perform well and the cluster who perform poorly, and the explanation of variance between those groups. The paragraph doesn't stop there. Of course, you can't be expected to quote everything. That would take too long. You gotta put cutoff somewhere. But out of curiosity's sake, let's see what the rest of that paragraph says that Shaun decides to leave on the cutting room floor. It says, quote, "On the other hand, despite the low association at the individual level, large differences in social behavior separate groups of people when the groups differ intellectually on the average." This sentence is literally right after the one Skull-Shaun quotes. He could not have missed it. He had to have deliberately left this out. But what this does, whether you agree with Murray or you agree with this or not, that's another matter. But what this does is show that Murray is not being hypocritical at all when he says that variance in IQ may only explain 20% of an individual's difference in behavior from the rest of the world, but that group differences can have a greater fraction of this explained by IQ. And this has to do with ecological correlations, which are not explained in the bell curve. But for now, I'm not asking the viewer to believe this to be true, just that Murray was not engaging in some bait and switch. He was consistent. Skull-Shaun deliberately truncated the paragraph to make it look like Murray was engaging in a bait and switch, and it's pretty brazen. But frankly, this kind of dishonesty should be expected given his choice of target. The bell curve was written in 1994. So what's really the purpose of fixating on this fossil? Is it because he's honestly that interested in what the bell curve has to say and wants to share his findings with you? If so, why didn't he include this section here, which shows after controlling for IQ, race differences in income go away? This wasn't even presented in a 2-hour and 49-minute video on the book. This doesn't come up once. In fact, there's quite a bit of cut content that Skull-Shaun doesn't show in his video. So it's not likely that he's just interested in the book and sharing what he's read, giving a kind of book report. Now, Skull-Shaun supports institutional racial discrimination against European Americans. Call it affirmative action, call it diversity initiatives, but in practice, what it means is that if you're white, you get penalized in terms of getting into a university, getting a job, or getting promoted, and it's a pure race-based policy. And it is something that Skull-Shaun supports. And it's much easier to try to pathologize opposition to this policy than it is to actually argue for it. And so he's using the bell curve. This is my interpretation. Take it for whatever you think. Salt it to taste. So he's using the bell curve as a kind of effigy in order to pathologize criticism of his brand of institutional racism. The key underlying concept in modern institutional racism is equality between divergent human populations. Because, but this equality is impossible to prove, or at least nearly impossible to prove. But you'd think that the ones pushing for a racially discriminatory policy based on this, they would need to prove equality and prove that the disparities in life outcomes are a result of non-genetic factors, and particularly non-genetic factors that whites deserve to be discriminated against for. The lingering hand of Jim Crow, or some other kind of unquantifiable, unfalsifiable fable. But what Skull Shaun is doing instead of that, because that would be hard, what he is instead doing is he's trying to flip the burden of proof. Instead of making a case for why there should be racial discrimination against white people and proving cognitive equality between demographic groups, it's much easier to nitpick the bell curve and pathologize anyone who tries to argue that divergent evolution is something that happened and that it didn't stop at the neck in humans at precisely the time that it would be politically incorrect for evolution to continue. Now, throughout this series, there's obviously going to be lots more little dishonesties on the part of Skull Shaun, but I just thought it important to put this out early before people get too carried away passively accepting what Skull Shaun has to say. That said, I'm in the works on a comprehensive demolition of this bigot, likely at this very moment if I'm not sleeping. This guy is an evil son of a bitch.